You know, there's a phenomenon today of folks that are in politics, folks that are in leadership positions in faith-based systems, people that are in education, especially in corporate structures. You've seen this a lot lately, where somebody who's in diversity, equity, inclusion training, or someone at the very top of an organization or a seminary, let's say, or university, pushes a concept really far. Let's say, like years ago, I especially could see this, like in between the years of around 2013 to about 2018, especially with critical race theory, intersectionality, concepts of systemic oppression, systemic everything. And then all of a sudden, folks seem to pull back and then reintroduce, or to find a safer path, or whatever the case may be. And this is something that I've seen consistently now for, many, many years. But really, there's a name to this technique. It's not just a question of pushing and then hiding. What exactly do we call this again?
Yeah, this is the tech. It's a rhetorical strategy, or a rhetorical principle known as Motte and Bailey. And so that name was given to it by a philosopher named Nicholas Shackle in a paper in 2005. It's really a stunning paper called "The Vacuity of Postmodern Methodology," and he lays out this idea. It's really, it's a strategy of equivocation, as you said. People they push the idea really far, and then they can retreat back to something more defensible. That's the general idea. If somebody asks them questions or pushes them on it and say, "Oh no, we just mean," that's the way you'll usually see it phrased. What are you actually doing here? Oh, it's just this. It's just racial sensitivity training, for example, against, say, critical race theory. You see this kind of pattern play out, and this is called a Motte and Bailey, as Shackle described it. So you have to understand that a Motte and Bailey is a physical metaphor that he used, but of a type of castle. And we'll get that in a second, but he starts out by describing this other concept in this paper called Troll's Truisms, which roughly around the same time, within plus or minus a few years, another philosopher, Dan Dennett, from Tufts, was calling these things deepities, which is a cute word. I think an 8-year-old or something said it when he described it at a dinner. The deepities, they're deep, but they're not deep, so they're deepities. And so the idea is that you have some fantastic falsehood that trades along with a trivial truth, or a truism, so Troll's truism. So for Shackle, it was a person who's kind of trolling the situation. So there's your troll, and he's spouting truisms, things that just anybody would agree with. And then he says that the Troll's truism situation sets up a natural Motte and Bailey. And in the paper, being that it's about the vacuity, as he says, of postmodern methodology, he actually just says that the entirety of postmodern philosophy boils down to a kind of a language game that is a Motte and Bailey rhetorical strategy. And so what happens is, to understand, it's kind of helpful we have this fire pit in front of us, because it's sort of like the beginning of a Motte. So a Motte and a Bailey, it's kind of a defensive castle arrangement that you might have had in, medieval feudal times. And so you might have, a square mile or thereabouts. A lot of times I tell people about the Lord of the Rings and the Pelennor fields, or whatever it is, outside of Minas Tirith, and you have the defensible tower, but then you have this huge, great area of farmland, and you might, then they have the outer wall. So it'd be either a small outer wall or a ditch that would be dug in the middle there of this farmland, or this village area, the Bailey as it's called. There would be a mound, and on the mound they would build a castle, in the sense of like the chess piece. It looks very much like the rook or the castle chess piece that's almost impregnable. You don't really want to live in it. It's going to be dark, it's going to be dank, it's probably, I think Nicholas Shackle describes it as being insalubrious. It's an insalubrious place, but it's virtually perfectly defensible. And so you could get in that, you could rain down rocks or arrows or whatever if people tried to conquer. And so what he says is, you have this ditch around the desired land, the Bailey's the desired land, you have this ditch around it, so it's lightly defended, lightly defensible, but if there's a real press, the ditch isn't going to stop people, or the moat, or a small wall, or a hill, or something like that, a border hill, isn't going to stop people. And so all of a sudden everybody can run from the Bailey and gather in the motte, and they're in a highly impregnable castle now, and they can rain down arrows and rocks and boiling oil or whatever weapons they had at their disposal to wait out the siege and get the marauders or whatever to go away, at which point they can then come back out into the Bailey and occupy the desired land again. So he puts this in a rhetorical frame by saying, well, there are certain arguments that people want to advance that are very lightly defensible. You know, on maybe the very most superficial first blush, you can defend them. But if you get any deeper than the most superficial layer, you can't defend them. So it's like the ditch. And then there's this really, you know, desired rhetorical or activist or whatever position you want to push, and that's the Bailey territory. But as soon as you say, hey, wait, you know, what's going on here? Let's get into the details. We just mean, and they can retreat into this highly defensible position of the Motte. So, you know, I just brought up a great example of that, which is to say, you know, we could go full-blown critical race theory, whether it's in our schools, whether it's in our federal agencies, you know, all this training. And then they say, no, we just mean racial sensitivity training. We just mean diversity training. And of course, President Trump got hit with that exact thing in the presidential debate, I think the first one with Joe Biden last year, when he was asked, why, Chris Wallace asked him, why do you want to cancel diversity training or racial sensitivity training, whichever one he named it? And the media played this game all around him. But the thing is that operates on this false assumption that there's only really one way to do racial sensitivity or diversity, or, you know, enhancement or whatever, or caring about diversity, and that it's through critical race theory. So, we really want to indoctrinate people with critical race theory. That's their Bailey. And then somebody says something to them, and whoop, into the Motte they go. They hide in the castle, and they have this very defensible thing. No, we just want racial sensitivity. We just care about diversity. We just want social justice, as opposed to, you know, a complete reprogramming of society along this ideological line, or whatever the thing is. And we see this happen again and again and again.
Or even like they throw out a syllogistic argument then at that point, where they would say something like, well, are you telling me that you don't see systemic oppression ever occurring in the history of our country? Are you saying that you haven't seen racism occur in the foundation of our laws and so forth over the history of the last 300 or 400 years in Western civilization? Are you saying that you haven't seen colonization, you know, as opposed to, well, what's actually happening now? And no, we're not saying that. So why are you even asking the question?
Or you're just a racist and a white supremacist who wants to maintain your, that's getting inside the Motte and then shooting the arrows down to try to drive people off. And so you can really see what's going on here. So, you know, for Nicholas Shackle, what he points out in the paper is that once people are aware of that this strategy is occurring, he says it's fatal to their argument, because people, once they realize that there's a bait and switch, if you will, or an equivocation more accurately occurring, then they don't trust the person pulling the stunt. And his argument is the whole of postmodernism, as one example, is trading in this regard. And in fact, it does it on the concept of truth, which we could talk at length about how postmodernism has a relationship to truth, but ultimately it argues, just to make it very brief, that truth is a socially constructed artifact because people are the ones doing it, and certain people become experts through some process that's ultimately political. So their proclamations about what truth are, that's ultimately the result of a political process. So politics is all it is. So truth becomes power, or knowledge becomes power. And Michel Foucault explicitly said that you cannot possibly liberate truth from power, because truth is power. He actually wrote that. And so they have this whole idea, truth is just a social construct. Therefore, and this is your Bailey territory, it could have been constructed differently. It could be constructed completely different. We could have other ways of knowing. We can have other knowledges. We could have racial knowledges, for example. We could have cultural knowledges. And the methodologies that we've honed over the past several hundred years, following from the various stages of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and so on, the Reformation in religious circles, in Christianity, I should specify, those methodologies for somebody following this line of thought that Foucault really articulated, they're just playing a power game. They're just messing around with power. They're just asserting power because they've been given the authority. They've been authenticated as the authorities to get to say that. And so for them, truth could just be completely reconstructed some other way. We could have a completely different cultural milieu or construct that allows us to have a different view of knowledge and different view of truth, and thus different application of power. And so the idea that any of these methodologies point to something real is removed. And so there's your exciting falsehood. We can reconstruct truth however we want. And that's where they want to be, because then they can create as I've called them, following Joseph Piper's pseudo-realities, in which people have to participate, where they have all of the advantage, all of the power. They're not real descriptions of realities. And it's trading off of, though, a very banal truism that, because we express our ideas in language, and we have a social consensus about what words mean, or what words will mean in particular contexts. For example, in the scientific context, are usually very precise. We're not screwing around with, what words mean when we get into the scientific context. It's very precise. So because there's these social processes, language, expertise, methodology, the derivation of methodology, all of a sudden, they're saying, oh, well, those are social processes, and this is a boring truism. It doesn't magically transform whether it's scientific method, or whether it's rigorous philosophy, whether it's exegesis, whether it's logic, whatever these methodologies happen to be in different disciplines, different fields. It doesn't transform them into arbitrary. So the Bailey is arbitrary. The Motte is, oh, well, we just mean people are involved in the process of producing knowledge, and those people have political interests or biases or whatever else. And so you can see that and so for Nicholas Shackle, that particular equivocation, that particular Motte and Bailey, is the essence of postmodernism.
Right. And you just don't see it in what they seek to achieve in the here and now with some concept or idea now. It's also something that they do historically in terms of deconstruction as well. So when they're looking back. So,
well, if we want to go into deconstruction in particular, I'm assuming we're going to tip toward Derrida. Derrida was looking at words. He was doing these deconstruction is a linguistic phenomenon for Derrida. Foucault did not, I don't think, directly do deconstructions himself, but people have derived a deconstructive process off of Foucauldian thought that is referred to as a Foucauldian deconstruction. But with Derrida, he was looking at words and the way that words have meanings in relationship to one another, and that he believed that there were hierarchical arrangements between certain words and the meanings of certain words. For example, man and woman. Right. And so, you can't understand if we didn't have men and women, we wouldn't have words for men and women. We would just have one word, man, or whatever it is. And so clearly those words exist in some relationship to one another. And for him, he had this concept that he locked onto, which is what he called phallogocentrism, or is called, which is that the male, that's the phallus, is put primary and centered in terms of the way that words are organized. It's also for, the queer theorists today, the male, the cisgender, the straight, etc., these kinds of terms that they throw around, those things are centered versus the other thing being subordinate. So heterosexual versus homosexual, you wouldn't have those words if there wasn't some power relationship between them, if one didn't define the other and existing in that pair. And so what a deconstruction was to either pick out the absurdity within that to make it look ridiculous, or to flip the power dynamic over. This is usually called strategic essentialism, when it trades off of essentialized characteristics of groups. For example, that's Gayatri Spivak's take off of Derrida there. She translated Derrida, so she was familiar with Derrida. So what that would be then is, you have two options. It's to deconstruct the idea that hierarchical structure to the words means anything at all, or the other is, let's maintain the binary and flip it over. And those are both types of deconstruction that can be done. So you're deconstructing the power either by dissolving it, or you're deconstructing the alleged power in the language by reversing it as a so-called act of strategic resistance. You hear these kinds of things all the time from kind of social justice-oriented people. And so a lot of deconstruction does proceed in this manner, where there's, the idea that, words exist in relationship to one another. This is the heart of deconstruction. And there are sometimes, some word is favored over another. For example, heterosexual is statistically far more common. Just to leave it at that, homosexuality is statistically far less common. Therefore, there's a normativity to heterosexuality, so there's heteronormative society. So then there's this belief that language is constructed heteronormatively, that might have to be deconstructed so that people who are not in the heteronormative power structure, which they would claim is generated by language, can feel accepted or included, not excluded. And the thing is all of this is the same. This is all the same kind as what we were just talking about. It's the same kind of very expansive Bailey kind of desired position, which is, oh, well, if these things are actually socially constructed by how we use language and how we've put words together, then why not put words together in a different way? So the entire social constructivist thesis is a huge Motte and Bailey, because the Motte is social construction is total, or sorry, the Motte is social constructions happen, and the Bailey is social constructions are the totality of what we're operating in, and therefore they're also arbitrary. Therefore we can question everything down to the very foundations, take everything apart to the very foundations, and if we want, rebuild them upside down, as it might be said, or in some other postmodern way that has to be held up by magic, where the magic spell here is linguistic. It's not, wizards, it's linguistic magic that does it, or something that allows people, again in Joseph Piper's language, to enter into this pseudo-real environment, a false reality. I think a distorted reality is a better way to portray this. But the Motte and Bailey is, again, how this works, because you push them on the, it's like how they get away with it is the Motte and Bailey. You say, well, yeah, some stuff is socially constructed. Our words are in some sense arbitrary. We could talk in Spanish, for example, or we could talk in Chinese, which even has very different grammar to it. And that's going to, so there is some arbitrariness to our language, and maybe it does influence the way that we think. It's suggested, for example, that the Greeks and the Germans were so good with systematic philosophy.
It's the argument for the reasonable person. Right.
Sure.
Right.
There's something to this.
Right.
There's something to this. But this is a far cry from, oh, well, if we just assert a sentence like trans women are women, that it makes it so, by making that the new normative thing. That's Bailey territory that can't be defended. And then you say, well, you can't just speak stuff like this into existence. You can't change reality by how you talk about reality. And they say, oh, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. It's just that knowledge and what we think of ourselves as, whether it's gender or sex or whatever, is socially constructed. And social construction it occurs everywhere. Like cultural construction of gender. Look how people in this culture and that culture, men and women, they dress differently from one another. And so they can retreat to this very defensible position. And again, the whole game is the same game. In fact, I defer back to Nicholas Shackle, and I think that this is partly true but not total, is that once you understand the game, if you're savvy, the whole thing falls apart. It's fatal to their argument. Now the problem is they keep making their argument, so it doesn't tell you really in a practical sense what you have to do about it, which is more complicated. Like, how do you deal with peddlers of pseudo-reality, who when you then push them, retreat to something that people identify or say is, yeah, that's sort of true. Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. I mean, these are the kinds of, I'm trying to give people phrases that they might notice in themselves. That, oh, we just mean, or, oh, I see what you mean, but, if you catch yourself in those feelings, or you hear somebody saying, it's just that. Then all of a sudden you gotta put your fox ears up and think, am I dealing with a Motte and Bailey? And if you are, my suggestion would be that you immediately need to be distrustful and to realize that there's probably two positions, and the one that they say after it's just is not what they really mean. They don't just want to have racial education in schools, in your K through 12 schools. They don't just want to be able to teach the history of the Holocaust or of the massacre in Tulsa or whatever. They don't just want to teach these things. They don't just want to teach, American history about slavery or Jim Crow. They want to teach it in a particular way, and there's your Bailey. They want to do this. They want to do something very much more specific. And that thing has to also, you have to become aware when this is occurring so that you can identify both. And I do have a strategy for fighting this, which I've called stealing their Motte and bombing their Bailey. So the idea of the Motte and Bailey, to go back to the castle structure, is they can go inside the Motte and they can rain rocks and arrows down on you till you go away. So I think, take their Motte first. Why not just take their Motte, go into their Motte, enter their Motte, rain arrows down on their Bailey, chase them out of the field. They want to occupy, get them out, chase them out. And the way you do that is you have to understand the argument that the defensible position is making. You have to be able to articulate what it is, and you have to be able to articulate the truth in it, the partial truth, the fertile fallacy, the truth, the kernel of truth in the fertile fallacy, accurately and well enough to convince an audience that you understand it better than they can if you can. That's stealing their Motte. And then you also have to say, but I know what you want to do with this. You don't want to have merely education about slavery or Jim Crow or segregation in schools. You want to teach people that the founding of America was intrinsically racist, and it established a system in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution that has perpetuated racism from the beginning, that's totally endemic to the system, and that cannot be removed short of a total revolution that actually rejects those founding documents and the principles, the earlier philosophical principles upon which they were founded. That entire tradition being thrown out and replaced with this new thing, that's the real objective. And of course I've said what it is, but the more of it you can articulate and the more clearly, the more accurately you're going to be able to bomb their Bailey and take them out of the position. That's the only response I know, is expose that this is happening and then flip it over on them by making the argument for reality better than they are, and simultaneously comparing that against the other side of their equivocation. In other words, they want to equivocate and you have to de-equivocate. You have to take both sides of the position well and argue them both, because you're dealing with people who are playing linguistic slippery games and occupying pseudo-reality, as a matter of fact.
Where can you give me 2 examples of where you have seen this in real world? And let's try to find it in 2 different categories or 2 different areas or affinities.
So besides like just gender and race as topics, you mean like places?
Actual real-time situations where you've seen this done?
Well, I mean, obviously the example of the schools that I just gave should resonate with a lot of people, right? The educational program is extraordinarily significant.
Right.
The Black Lives Matter movement is another one. The entire movement, because you have this extraordinarily defensible position that you can retreat to. We're just saying that black people's lives matter.
Of course.
Which is of course.
Right.
Of course. And it's not impossible, unfortunately, but it's difficult to find people who disagree with this proposition. But then the Black Lives Matter organization and movement has very different agendas. So when you say the 3-word phrase, which is, homophonic with, it sounds exactly the same as the, statement, the black people's lives matter, you all of a sudden are also endorsing this movement to a degree. You are engaging in their brand identification, and their agenda is very different. You have Patrice Cullors coming out and saying we're trained Marxists, and they start describing who their intellectual influences are and what they want. We just had the expose recently that they felt like Patrice Cullors again wanting her book to be regarded like Mao's Little Red Book. Wonderful little expose there. So they have a very different agenda. It was on their website for a while that they're going to demolish the family, etc. Now they have this new list of demands on their website. These are very radical demands. They are not compromising demands. It's true that their ideology is steeped deeply in neo-Marxism. They speak about that through the idea of black liberation, which was infused with neo-Marxism by Herbert Marcuse, taking up the liberationist cause and blending those things together. There's an identifiable chain of people, Marcuse to Angela Davis, to the black feminists, to people like Kimberly Crenshaw, writing about it and mapping the margins, citing Angela Davis and mapping the margins. You have this identifiable trail from neo-Marxism to critical race theory that connects the dots all the way through to the current Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a Motte and Bailey with Black Lives Matter for a second example. So we got schools, we got Black Lives Matter. You're going to see this in, churches, you'll see it in companies in kind of the same way. We just want to, we want to hear out our people of other, or diverse voices or whatever more clearly. Diversity, in fact, and inclusion are Mottes and Baileys in that regard too. What do they really want with hearing out our more diverse voices, or our black brothers and sisters you might hear? Well, the thing is of course we want to listen to people. Of course we want to understand that people might have a different experience of life, and there might actually be some issues that appear in subtle or even like broad systemic flavored ways. I want to hesitate around the word systemic because it has a very specific meaning, and I don't want to fall into my own Motte and Bailey problem here.
Right.
But what they actually mean, though, is they can say this, and of course we want to go along with that. There's your Motte, your very defensible position. Well, what's the Bailey? The Bailey actually, for, say, diversity and hearing diverse voices. So if you hear this in your church or your company, it's about bringing diverse voices, diverse perspective, diverse expertise. Well, under the ideology of the so-called woke ideology, people are using critical social justice theory, you might call it, or just theory, is the doctrine of structural determinism. This is core, for example, to critical race theory, that the structure of society, meaning the systems, this is why I was hesitant around systemic racism, systems like racism or white supremacy, systems like patriarchy, systems like heteronormativity that I referred to before, etc., create a deterministic outcome for people in the oppressed groups, oppressed by those so-called systems or power dynamics. And so, because they have this structurally deterministic view, that grants them, as critical race theory phrases, a unique voice of color.
Right.
And that unique voice of color is only authentic, again, another specifically used word where they're equivocating between the normal meaning and the specific meaning, when it is informed by a critical consciousness of that system of power and its impacts. Well, the only people who produce that are the critical theorists. So in this case, critical race theorists are the only people who have the authentic voice of color. So this is why, for example, when you saw, I know we're diverging from the church or the business, but when Kanye West, I dragged this example up a million times, he put on the Make America Great Again hat and he said, I think for myself. They replied, Ta-Nehisi Coates replied with, you're not black anymore.
Right.
Which Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, the New York Times Magazine, clarified for us in a tweet she deleted, which was, there's a difference between being racially black and politically, capital B, black.
Right.
There's a difference. And what they say, when they say diversity, what they actually mean, Motte and Bailey, what they actually mean, it's not about just hearing different voices or bringing in different expertise. It's about bringing in people who have a critical consciousness. In other words, critical, whether it's race or otherwise, critical theorists. In other words, neo-Marxists of some stripe or another, or people who have dived into this very lived experience-based version that's postmodern informed, the woke ideology, if you will. So it's about bringing in woke activists.
Right.
Under the guise of diversity. There's a Motte and Bailey for you see in real life, happening all the time. Equity is another one. It's about equal access. No, it's not. It's about equal outcomes. But they say it's about equal access because they believe that under a total social constructivist thesis where nobody's different, Ibram Kendi actually says this, it can't possibly be cultural differences. It can't possibly be cultural differences or anything to do with how people are raised or what they do or how they might, approach things. Can't possibly be that, because that would be to say that the culture is wrong, and that violates cultural relativism. Kendi actually says that cultural relativism is necessary for anti-racism because of that. Can't be something like that. It absolutely can't be. You're just saying, and he says this frequently, that if you're saying that there are different outcomes with equal access on the front end, then you're saying there's something wrong with those people, and he's implying essentially wrong with those people. Because it can't be the fact that the cultures either just don't match, which is one possibility. You could be in a situation where you have great cultural values, but they don't match the circumstances you're in.
Right.
Or because the cultural values don't produce as great outcomes as others. A simple value is punctuality. Are you punctual or not? Well, I even talked to a data scientist who looked into this, and I think we talked about this once before, is that if you start shifting, like how he created a simulation. So I don't know how accurate a simulation is. Let's not get lost in models and all that discussion, but he created a simulation where he just had a slider where he could, people on average show up 1 minute late, 2 minutes late, 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late, or whatever, and he just tracked the drop in productivity in a system where all of a sudden you have on average people showing up late, and so schedules aren't as synchronized, so punctuality is dropping out of the picture. And what he saw is that the productivity drops off precipitously. A very small number of minutes, and it just drops off. And within not very many minutes, productivity drops to a kind of a floor, not zero, but very close to zero. And so, those values being different, just the value of punctuality, which I don't know why we have to assign that to any particular identity group. Anybody can be punctual, just show up on time. Right. I don't like to show up on time. I run late all the time. I'm not, I get it, right? But anybody can do this. Anybody can adhere to this value. And so, but Kendi utterly throws this out under their program. So he's talking about equal access under an assumption that equal access automatically will imply equal outcomes unless you're having racist assumptions somewhere in between. Right. And so their game is to jimmy the system under a doctrine of creating equal access, and they're going to keep messing with it until you come out with equal outcomes. Right. So I just saw today, somebody sent me an article where a school system is now No longer, if you do none of the work, nothing, fail all your tests, get 0 credit, right? What grade should you get? 50%. Why? For equity.
That's right.
You get 50% credit. And we saw this with when the pandemic began. They were trying to figure out what to do with kids who were taken out of schools. Well, what do we do with their grades? How do we figure out their grading assessment? And one of the proposed solutions was give everybody A's for equity. Why? Because the lower your GPA, the more an A raises it. And if you already have good grades, an A doesn't raise it as far. So it creates a more equitable outcome by what? Changing the access somehow to what grades mean. Like now it's more accessible, everybody. But this is just creating equal outcomes in a very artificial way based on bad assumptions. So there's a Motte and Bailey with the word equity. We could do it with inclusion, we could do it with a lot more words, but these are things that touch people's lives. I'll do inclusion actually. Let me just go on a tear here for a minute, because inclusion properly upsets me. Because inclusion, yeah, we want people to sit around the table or the fire pit, I guess, with us. We do want people to feel included. Nobody wants to feel bad, and very few people want to make other people feel bad as a matter of course, or even by accident. People tend to be generally polite. I guess that's a cultural value that I would say is probably pro-social. People want other people to feel included. If you want a workplace, you want people to feel included, because having psychological safety is crucial to creating the kinds of dynamics where mentorship works, where teamwork flourishes, where people are willing to be open about their ideas. John Cleese has a wonderful talk many years ago on YouTube about creativity. And he talks about how he and the Monty Python guys got back in a room and they literally, they say, throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. That's what they did. And being totally creative, just the most off the wall stuff. And maybe 5% of it was good enough to make it to the flying circus or whatever. But that's how you do it. And what you need to do that though is psychological safety. If you feel like you're going to be judged, and that was John Cleese's point, it's not going to work. You can't relax. You can't be creative. You can't connect. You're walking on eggshells, you hear a lot. So inclusion is something everybody wants. Well, there's your mot. We don't want anybody to feel uncomfortable. We don't want anybody to feel like they can't participate. We don't want anybody to feel like they're excluded. But the doctrine of inclusion relies on ideals like microaggressions and the willful, deliberate creation of hypersensitivity, of learning to spot problems where problems aren't, and then to blow those problems up to big, big problems without making mountains out of molehills, without offering like reliable ways to then mediate across those problems. All of a sudden it's, oh, well, white people have white culture, black people have black culture, they can't actually understand each other, so now we have an intractable issue. Eggshells everywhere. You never know if somebody's in the office is going to blow up, because now you have inclusive policies. What inclusion actually means is nobody who's in a so-called protected group, and that's very important because it's not everybody, nobody who's in a protected group is allowed to be offended, and nothing, in fact, whether it's speech codes or behavior, by speech codes or by behavior codes, anything that anybody, even the like most busybody, I hate to lean into a kind of unfair meme, but middle class white woman wine mom might, on behalf of somebody else as a white savior or whatever, find offensive on somebody else's behalf. I call that taking offense by proxy. They get to find the offense for somebody else who wasn't even offended. An inclusive environment can have none of that. So you have a very stifled space. And it can go so far as to demand segregation. Because, again, that structural determinism we talked about a moment ago. Well, in a structurally determined white supremacist system, what does that mean? That means that the white supremacist system is everywhere. It's imminent. It's all around us. It's everywhere always. There's no escape from it unless you create a willfully segregated space. So why do you have these black only or people of color only events and rooms and things being created for inclusion? A literal, deliberate exclusion of certain people, because it's believed that anywhere white people go, and anywhere that the space hasn't been completely set up by and for some particular ethnic group, that white male gaze, or the white gaze as it's sometimes called, or the white racial frame, or some aspect of the white supremacist hegemony comes in with the white person, and now all of a sudden that structural dynamic is being pressed upon the people of color. So they literally have to recreate segregated spaces under the term desegregation in order to escape from the structurally determinate forces that they believe shape society. Meanwhile, of course, like I said a minute ago, that's making them more hypersensitive, less able to cope with reality in a genuinely diverse society with actual differences, and therefore hypersensitizing them so that the inclusion demand becomes more and more and more.
And what does that do to a workspace, let's say? If you're in a workspace, what does it do?
It's like filling it with like bags and bags and bags of ice.
Yep.
It's eggshells on the floor, ice everywhere. Everybody's afraid somebody's going to call them out. Everybody's afraid to speak up. Everybody's afraid to be creative. Everybody's afraid to there's evidence showing with teamwork and with mentorship.
Right.
The people just hole up.
Right.
You start balkanizing your workplace. But then there's another aspect to this ham-fisted idiocy. I've heard from probably hundreds. I was going to say thousands, but that's probably an exaggeration. I've heard from hundreds, I would say, either, and they're virtually all, either brown, black, gay, or trans.
Right.
One of these categories, who at their workplace, they ended up having a sensitivity training brought in by this ideology because somebody knew that they were there, and this is what everybody has to do. And inclusion training is what it boils down to.
Right.
And what would happen is everybody would go around and have to, like, because their methods are ridiculous, they'd have to confess, oh, I've always been a little bit racist, or I've always thought you gay people were a bit weird. How do you have sex? Very awkward kinds of personal questions, and then the whole place just gets real awkward now. It's like you just had this great relationship you thought with John at the office, and all of a sudden John just told you, I've always kind of hated you because of your skin color, just a little bit. And like now you still got to work with this guy, right? And this is a disaster. There's nothing to say except that it's a disaster. And this is supposed to foster inclusion.
Right.
And we're supposed to, watching these things shatter corporate cultures or churches or communities, or if, whatever it is, the community within an affinity, like you got your rock climbing club, your D&D group or whatever.
Right.
There's a little culture, a little social environment rises up there. That whole thing gets just wrecked. Because everybody's afraid somebody's going to get called out or something weird got injected in the name of inclusion.
Right. At the same time, putting in training for microaggressions and microassaults and so forth, so everybody is just ready for something.
They're looking.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's the point.
Hypersensitivity.
That's the point of critical theories. You're supposed to be finding those problematics where, that's why you have to go to microaggressions. You have to be able to find those problematics where they exist. I always give that example of entering it, two people, a white person and a black person, enter a store at the same time.
Right.
Critical race theory you have to help somebody first. How does critical race theory analyze it? Well, racism must have taken place. A critical race theorist is the person who knows how to find it. And so it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, it doesn't matter what the intentions were, it doesn't matter who's involved. It could be a white person, it could be Kanye West with his MAGA hat on, who knows? And they come up and they try to help the customer, and you have to pick white or black, and you pick white and, you think black people are second-class citizens, you racist. Or you pick black and it's, you didn't trust them to be in your store. They have the magic power of finding the offense everywhere. And microaggressions take that to the most absurd level. Do you even know the story, by the way, of where microaggressions came from as a concept?
No, I don't. Tell me.
So Daryl Wing Sue is the name behind this. And so Daryl Wing Sue, and I'll probably get the details a little bit. I haven't read it in a hot minute, but I'll probably get some of the details. We can check it at some point. But the point is that he and I think another person of color were on an airplane. And they had one of those weight imbalance deals where they make you move around.
I did hear this. Yes.
Right? Yes, they make you move.
Right.
Because, the plane is like tilted and it won't take off safely. I don't know, something. This has happened to me on a few flights, of course. It's happened to a lot of us. Well, sir, could you move we needed somebody bigger in the front and somebody smaller in the back, or whatever it is. We got too many heavy people on the right side versus the left. Move around. It happens once in a while. Certain aircraft, it's worse than others.
Right.
So this happened on their flight. And it turned out that Daryl Wing Sue and another person of color were the two people asked by the flight attendant to move.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this was racism. Oh, you picked people of color. And it was like, no, really, it's just the seats that you're in.
Right.
No, I perceived it as racist because it's just me and another person of color. That was a microaggression, whether you intended it or not. That's where the concept came from. That was the originating example of a microaggression given. And that's how ridiculous this is. There's probably a Motte and Bailey here too. I perceived it, that's a Bailey. I perceived offense, therefore offense occurred. That's a Bailey. Well, the Motte is, you can't judge my feelings. You can't get inside my head to, nobody knows what's actually happening. Which is total BS with these people, by the way, because they know your intentions.
Right.
Your intentions were racism, 100. The flight attendant, the poor flight attendant, It's like, no, really, you're just in the wrong chair. This is racism. You know, imagine being in that position before all, this was years and years ago, before any of this blew up. So it's like, you know, imagine you're just on your heels, you don't know what to do, you have to try to make this person happy, and all this person is a troublemaker. And then you put this in an environment, like an office or a church or whatever, and some people around for reasons of, you know, sometimes for like self-interest, sometimes just because they're not thinking through things, sometimes just because it creates an incentive, and incentives are like gravitational. They pull people do incentivize things. Now all of a sudden, complaining and whining about everything and finding problems everywhere. Like, oh, this person gets their way all of a sudden. They just said it's racist. I get my way. And I've heard stories explicitly about that. You know, people, for example, in colleges failing their class and they're not doing very well, and they go to the dean and start crying and saying, well, I just can't get over how much racism I hear. And it's, oh, well, let's adjust your grade. Well, this has happened. This has happened. And then guess who's out? Whatever professor the professor, innocent probably, who got accused of racism, gone. Loses their job so that some kid can get a better grade on a test or something.
Right.
Absolutely nuke a career, but so that you can get your C turned into an A or your F turned into a C or whatever. And this creates an incentive, and people will occasionally, especially the less scrupulous, which might be thoughtless and it might be, you know, actually, malicious isn't the right word, but, you know, not scrupulous, will gravitate toward those incentives. So you put that into your company now. So now you're incentivizing, or your church or your whatever, you're incentivizing people to find and make hay out of extraordinarily minor problems. You think that's going to make a charming workplace or a fun place for people to show up or want to participate or throw out a new creative idea or take a risk?
Right.
It's like the whole thing. Critical theory,
or even order lunch for the group.
No kidding. Are you kidding?
Right.
Like, all of a sudden, like, crab rangoon isn't like real Chinese food, but yes, it is where I come from, and I don't know, now there's an office meltdown. Nobody wants to participate in this kind of thing, and this is, these ideas have to be understood then. These Bailey ideas that are being shuttled in by these, oh, very nice, very good intentioned, oh, you know, we just want positions. These very bad ideas can't create anything except that they sow chaos and discord and enmity. All they do is take your whatever value you have in a cultural group or a church or an office culture or you know, a company, and they spend down every last dime of, say, social capital or whatever it is that you have, or camaraderie that you have, or team spirit or whatever. They just spend it right down so that the people that are most invested in pushing the ideology, not even the people who are grifting off of it, can advance the ideology further. It's horrible.
Now, to kind of wrap up, I know that you and I have discussed this before. If someone is faced with this kind of false dilemma, or the Motte and Bailey, or whatever the case may be, what would you say would be the best way to just simply answer someone who's playing this game with you?
You have to call, it's the same thing almost as steal the Motte and bomb the Bailey. You have to call out the dynamic. And I know, and we've talked about my book with Peter Boghossian, How to Have Impossible Conversations. Well, we talk about it briefly in that book, which had a different purpose, but there's another book we read called Difficult Conversations that came out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. Douglas Stone, I think, is the lead author on that. Stone, Heenan, Patton, or something, and I don't remember which order. But this is a wonderful book, and it actually talks about when you have a communication breakdown, especially one that falls into these categories of it's no longer really a logical discussion. You have to take one step back from the conversation to a meta conversation and name the dynamic. And in this case, because often it's being pushed by somebody who's a bit manipulative, you have to be able to name the dynamic very, very clearly and point out both sides of what's happening. You have to be able to identify if it's a Motte and Bailey. Here is your Motte. This is the argument you want to make. Here's how I can make it better. Here's the thing that you're trying to do with it. This is a manipulation and it's not going to work here. You kind of go, I don't mean to sound silly, but there's a little bit of going Gandalf on these people too. You know, you drive the stake down into the bridge and you're like, you know, you shall not pass or whatever. But what you're actually saying is, I know this, and I mean this literally. You can actually say this. I know this manipulation and it doesn't work on me.
Right.
And then if pressed, you can name the manipulation. And if you can't, you need to practice. You need to get yourself where you can. And that diffuses it, because now you've stepped back and named the dynamic. You've named the dynamic, and now you're having a conversation about what's happening rather than being caught in the kind of alligator swamp where they're dragging you in and rolling you around.
Right, where you're almost saying, well, I want to listen to them, and I want to be reasonable and so forth, but what you're really doing is getting yourself sucked into this whole line of argumentation.
I've referred to it in the past as like a swamp with alligators in it, and the goal of the alligator is to pull you into the swamp and roll you.
And once you're there, it's almost impossible to get out.
You can't. Yeah.
Right.
Because it's all emotional. Now the crowd is judging you based on how, what you said, and every little thing you say is going to be, examined with lawyerly intent for every possible guess. Remember, you aren't allowed to guess their intentions, but they're allowed to guess yours. So everything you do has these bad intentions behind it. You're just trying to maintain your white comfort.
Even if you're unconscious of them.
Even if you're unconscious, your unconscious bias. Yeah.
Right.
There's even one there, not to divert, but there is a Motte and Bailey between implicit bias and unconscious bias. Implicit bias is some vaguely detectable nonsense that is borderline pseudoscientific, but there is data that it shows something. No one's quite sure what it shows. That's the important thing to take away. Unconscious bias, however, is just a new name for false consciousness.
Right.
Right. There's a Motte and Bailey there too.
Right. Right. So what you're saying is that throughout, it doesn't matter what affinity group they're part of, or corporate or educational, wherever the case may be, is that you're seeing people that are being dragged into an argument instead of just calling it out. And I think we can see recently where so many have now come to their school board meetings or whatever the case may be and just called it straight out and said, stop the manipulation, I want this out.
That's right.
As opposed to thinking, oh, we just need to get into a long discussion and so forth.
Let's bring in both sides to the table and hash it out. No, the other side doesn't want to hash it out. They want to survive the encounter by retreating into their mind.
Survive the encounter.
And the second the encounter's over, like, oh, well, let's hear the critical race theory side out. Oh, well, they said they just wanted racial sensitivity training. Wham, next thing you know, America is a structurally racist and systemically racist country. Structural determinism is a part of, they don't want to say it in those words. This creates different outcomes. Oh, well, we better start segregating students again. They're going to go right back to it. Oh, your privilege is determinant of your position and your positionality in terms of the privilege hierarchy is going to determine your range of possible outcomes in life. They're going to be right back to it. The goal of the Motte and Bailey strategy is to get in the Motte, survive the encounter, and go back to your, as the kids say, back on their bullshit.
And so now you're going further to the synthesis.
Sure, if we put it in a dialectical term, every time this happens, typically what's happening, it doesn't fit the Motte and Bailey as a castle metaphor, but typically what's happening is the whole thing is moving just a little bit. But really, the Bailey's getting a little bit bigger. It takes a little bit more land every single time. And so that's that kind of synthetic position that you would receive. They get offered a challenge and they spin the challenge around, they defend themselves, and they come back out, and now they've incorporated that synthetically into their new argument. And the Bailey just got a little bit better because now this new white supremacist attack just came, and so now we have to be on guard for yet more white supremacy. And look how insidious it is. So yes, over and over and over and over again. And this is the thing that we sometimes, it gets called the ratchet. Like the ratchet only turns one direction, and a ratchet works by it turns and it clicks and it doesn't turn back. And it clicks and it doesn't turn back. And so that's the way that this actually kind of goes. They can take it a little further each time, and if you press them, they hide in the Motte.
That's right.
Survive the encounter. Wham! They're back out into their Bailey. I won't say it again.
Yeah.
But it's a good way to put it.
Yep.
It's a good way to put it. Oh, the diversity trainer's back on her bullshit. This is what's going to happen the second you stop paying attention and listen to their nonsense. Oh yeah, well, we just wanted to have more voices, more perspectives. You don't want more perspectives. You want specific perspectives that are informed by a so-called critical consciousness, which is the derivation of Marxist class consciousness taken into a new domain. It's not Marxism. It's not class consciousness. It's privilege consciousness is what critical consciousness is really about. And that's all they want, is people who can articulate the problematics in that regard.